Dear Culture and Literature students, welcome to Video 6. In Video 5, we began looking at the section in the book called Key Terms, Core Topics, and this is the second of two videos which review this section. I'll be using the MS Word file that we looked at last time, which has images in it. There's also another one with text in it, and so you might want to open those documents to follow along. I have opened the Microsoft Word document that we looked at in the last video, and these are images that remind us that we're looking at key terms and core topics. You know, the key and the Apple core to remind us of that. And there's also another Word document with a little bit of text about each one of the key terms and core topics, which you will probably want to refer to frequently at first, and then after a few times of review, I think you'll probably have those main ideas memorized, and all you will need is to look at the images. And even those you'll have memorized pretty quickly, I think. The first image reminds us of absence and presence, and that goes right along with gaps and silences, so I didn't repeat with different images for that. But the other idea is centers and margins. And then we have an axe, which reminds us of accent and dialect. And this hand that's stuck there to the axe handle with a writing utensil, a quill, reminds us of author and authority. And sitting on top of that feather, we have this cannon, which reminds us of canon and classic. We'll scroll up a little bit, and we see this guy right here who's a pencil, and he's hanging on to that cannon. He has a briefcase in his hand, and he looks like a character. In English, we say that if somebody's funny or if somebody has an interesting personality. So he looks like a character. That reminds me of character and characterization. Now, stuck in his briefcase here is a mask, two masks, and they remind us of comedy and tragedy. And carnival and the absurd go along with that. Now, resting on top of that mask, balancing there, is a disc, which reminds me of discourse and discourse analysis. And balancing on top of that disc, we have this stage. And that reminds me of drama and theater and film. We have film here, and TV, television. Now, on top of that stage, we see this soccer player, and he has a jersey on with a number 4 on the back of it. And the number 4 reminds me of foreground, and the fact that it's on the back of his jersey reminds me of background. Another term that goes along with that section in the book is point of view. This sign that's sticking out of he doesn't have a head, it's just a sign that's coming out of his neck there. It says John on it, and that reminds me of genre and kinds of text. And sleeping on top of that street sign is a cat, and that cat, I didn't scroll far enough up. Yeah, there we are. That cat is imagining a fish. I would imagine the cat is hungry, and so he's imagining a fish that he could eat. And that reminds me of images, imagery, and imagination. Now let's look at the key terms and core topics which we haven't reviewed yet. On top of this bubble where the cat is imagining a fish, you will notice there's a sign that says on air. This is something you would see in a radio station or a television station. On air. That reminds me of the word narrative, and the section narrative in story and history. The author points out that narrative is telling stories. They can be true or false, factual or fictional. And there are different mediums that are used to tell these stories, like, for example, novel or news or film. And film is more closed and concentrated, whereas television tends to be more open-ended and recursive. The last thing the author includes in this section is Labov's model for analyzing storytelling. Labov's model includes 6 stages of storytelling: abstract, orientation, complicating actions, evaluation, resolution, and code. Standing on top of this sign that says on air is a Smurf, and he's obviously reading some poetry, trying to impress somebody, and that reminds me of poetry and wordplay. And the author talks about different kinds of wordplay, like also sound play, visual play, structural play, and so forth. And these are all techniques that we use to play around with language to produce things like humor or poetry or lyrics to songs. Now, sitting here on the scroll of the Smurf, you will see a reel. It's a fishing reel, rod and reel. And that reminds me of realism and representation. The author explains that realism could refer to the classic 19th century realism, or it can also be used to refer to a movement which claims to offer a fresh, more faithful view of reality. Representation can also have one of 2 different meanings, either verbal description and visual depiction, or it could refer to acting on behalf of somebody or something. Fiction is imaginative literature, something made up. Some people have begun to use a term called faction, which is fact plus fiction, a combination of the 2 things. When a text calls attention to itself, we call that metafiction. You will notice that this fishing reel has kind of caught a picture frame. It's hooked in there, and this picture frame has 2 people in it, and they are carrying on a conversation, and that reminds me of speech, conversation, and dialogue. And the author explains a few things about speech. It's both a process and a product. It's transitory, spontaneous, and it uses a lot of context-sensitive words like I, you, this, that, here, and now. It includes both monologue and dialogue. Conversation is spoken interaction of all kinds, and this is an integral part of our society, history, and culture. Dialogue can refer to either a fictional representation of conversation, or it can refer to the dialogic principle as developed by Bakhtin. Attached to the corner of this picture frame is a guitar stand, and that reminds me of standards and standardization, varieties and variation. The term standard has a number of different definitions. One definition is average, routine, or common. Another definition is a flag or emblem. But the definition that we'll be using more in this context is a prescribed quantity or quality or a degree of excellence. The author of the textbook relates that the effort to define a standard English goes all the way back to the Anglo-Saxon period, and he traces those efforts all the way up through today, and he explains that today there are various standard Englishes depending on where you live in the world, if it's the Caribbean or Europe or North America or Australia, and we refer to those as varieties of English. And a variety is a linguistic product of difference. Differences between people or places or a medium or the context. Variation refers to the historical process of differentiation. Balancing on this arm of the guitar stand is a cell phone. And that cell phone has received a text message, and that reminds me of text, context, and intertextuality. A text is any instance of verbal record. Context is everything around the text, and intertextuality is the text's relation with other texts. There are three different kinds of intertextuality. When texts are overtly referred to, we call that explicit intertextuality. When texts are alluded to, we call that implied intertextuality. And sometimes other texts are just in the mind of the reader and he thinks about them even though they aren't mentioned or alluded to, and we call that inferred intertextuality. Balancing on top of this cell phone is a blackboard with a globe on it and hello written in several different languages from around the world, and that reminds me of translation and literature in translation. The author of the textbook explains that a translation, like many of these terms, are referred to both a process and a product. And one thing that is very difficult in translation is to translate verse or poetry, lyrics to songs. Those things present a really big challenge. The current emphasis in translation is on text in context. In other words, a dynamic equivalent which takes into consideration the culture. Sitting on top of the chalkboard, you see a poster which has a verse from the Bible on it, and that reminds me of versification, rhythm, meter, and rhyme. Versification refers to the formal organization of sounds that characterize verse. The textbook points out an important characteristic of the English language. It's a Germanic language, and because of that, it's stress-timed, as opposed to the Romance languages, including Spanish, which are syllable-timed. Syllables, stress, and time all work together to form rhythm. And meter refers to the measurement of time, or a measure. And rhyme refers to a number of different things like alliteration or similar sounding syllables that are repeated to produce what we call rhyme. And the author talks about iambic parameter, which is an interesting concept as well. And verse, there are some characteristics of verse, including regularity and flexibility, unity and variety, and order and repressiveness. On top of the poster with the verse on it is a picture of a lady. She looks like she might be a teacher, and she's reading and writing at the same time. And that reminds me of writing and reading, response, and rewriting. The author defines these terms for us in the following way. Writing is making verbal marks on paper. Reading is engaging with those verbal marks. Response is our reaction to and interaction with that text. And rewriting, he says, reminds us of the relations among the other three. That brings us to the end of key terms and core topics. I hope these last two videos will help you remember the concepts presented in Part 4 of the textbook and also give you ideas for creating your own memory tools. I wish you well as you prepare for the on-site exam. If you have any questions, please join the weekly chat session or send me an email at the address on the screen.